17 travelers vanished on the same mountain pass in 1875 West Virginia. Every single one stopped at a small cabin adorned with wooden crosses and Bible verses. The family inside wasn't offering salvation. They were selecting their next meal. Before we dive into the story, this case represents one of the most disturbing examples of how isolation and desperation can twist human nature into something unrecognizable. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel to support our investigation into these dark chapters of American history. Now let's continue with the story. The narrow mountain pass that wound through the rugged peaks of West Virginia's remote wilderness seemed like God's own country to weary travelers in 1875, and the small log cabin that sat nestled among the towering pines appeared to be a beacon of Christian hospitality in an unforgiving landscape. Hand-carved wooden crosses dotted the property like sentinels, while carefully painted Bible verses adorned the cabin's weathered walls, promising rest for the weary and food for the hungry. The Hartwell family had positioned their humble homestead perfectly along the treacherous route that connected the coal mining towns to the east with the farming communities spreading west, and for 3 years running, every merchant, preacher, and desperate soul who knocked on their door received the same warm Christian welcome. Elijah Hartwell, a tall man with deep-set eyes and a carefully maintained beard, would emerge from the cabin with his wife Ruth by his side, their voices raised in greeting as they quoted scripture and offered shelter from the mountain's unpredictable weather. Ruth, her graying hair pulled back in a modest bun and her dress simple but clean, had a motherly way about her that put even the most suspicious travelers at ease. While their grown children would gather on the porch with shy smiles and downcast eyes that spoke of humble mountain folk raised in the fear of the Lord. The family's reputation for generosity had spread along the trading routes, and drivers would specifically plan their journeys to coincide with a night's rest at the Hartwell cabin, where the food was hearty, the beds were clean, and the morning prayers were said with genuine conviction. But what those 17 souls who stopped at the cabin between 1873 and 1875 never realized was that the crosses weren't symbols of salvation, but markers in a hunting ground, and the Bible verses weren't expressions of faith, but carefully chosen justifications for acts that would have horrified even the most hardened frontier criminals. The Hartwell family had indeed found their calling on that remote mountain pass. But it wasn't the calling of Christian service that their religious decorations suggested. Instead, they had discovered that isolated travelers carrying money, goods, and most importantly, fresh meat, could disappear without a single witness to mark their passing, and that the perfect camouflage for predators was the costume of the devout. The mountain wilderness swallowed screams as easily as it swallowed bodies, and the Hartwells had learned to use both the terrain and their reputation to create the perfect trap for unsuspecting victims who trusted in the universal frontier code that a Christian home was a safe home. They were wrong, and their mistake would cost them everything. The Hartwell family tree had been twisted for 3 generations, but their isolation wasn't just geographic, it was genetic. What began as a simple homestead in 1842 had become a breeding ground for something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined, and the physical evidence of their inbreeding was written across their faces like a map of generational decay. Jeremiah Hartwell, the family patriarch who first carved their claim from the West Virginia wilderness, had arrived with his wife Martha and their 2 young children after fleeing debts and accusations of theft in Pennsylvania. The remote mountain location offered them exactly what they sought: complete isolation from the law, from neighbors, and from anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions about their past or their future. Jeremiah chose the spot not for its beauty or its resources, but for its inaccessibility, building his cabin in a hollow that could only be reached by following a treacherous path that discouraged casual visitors and eliminated the possibility of unexpected encounters with authorities. Within 5 years of establishing their homestead, Martha had died giving birth to their fourth child, leaving Jeremiah alone with two sons and two daughters in a place where the nearest neighbors lived more than 20 miles away across impassable terrain. Rather than seek a new wife from the distant settlements, Jeremiah made a decision that would doom his bloodline for generations to come. He encouraged his children to marry among themselves, justifying the practice with twisted interpretations of Old Testament scriptures about keeping bloodlines pure and maintaining family unity in the face of worldly corruption. The first generation of intermarriage between Jeremiah's children produced offspring with subtle deformities that could be explained away as frontier hardships. But by the time Elijah and Ruth, who were first cousins, began having children of their own, the genetic consequences had become impossible to ignore. Their eldest son Thomas bore a cleft palate that made his speech nearly incomprehensible, while their daughter Sarah suffered from a withered arm that hung useless at her side. The youngest boy, Isaac, had been born with eyes that pointed in different directions and a mind that never developed beyond that of a child, though his physical strength remained that of a full-grown man. Most disturbing of all was Mary, born to Elijah and Ruth's own children who had continued the family tradition of intermarriage, her features so distorted by generations of genetic damage that travelers often crossed themselves when they first saw her, mistaking her appearance for some kind of divine punishment. The family had learned to keep Mary hidden during the daylight hours when visitors might arrive, bringing her out only for the evening meals where her damaged mind and twisted loyalties served their dark purposes perfectly. The isolation that had once protected the Hartwells from outside judgment had also protected their genetic deterioration from outside intervention, and 3 generations of inbreeding had created not just physical monsters, but psychological ones as well. Their damaged minds had developed an inability to distinguish between right and wrong that went far beyond simple ignorance, while their genetic isolation had fostered a family loyalty so intense that they viewed outsiders not as fellow human beings, but as resources to be exploited for their survival. By 1875, the Hartwell bloodline had produced a family of individuals whose physical deformities were matched only by their mental instability, and their religious facade had become the perfect cover for appetites that no normal human being could comprehend or satisfy. To passing travelers, Elijah and Ruth Hartwell appeared as devout mountain folk, their cabin walls lined with hand-carved crosses and scripture verses, but their devotion served a darker purpose than anyone could have imagined. The religious performance they had perfected over 3 years of preying on innocent victims was so convincing that even experienced traders and circuit preachers found themselves lowering their guard in the presence of such apparent piety. Elijah had studied the traveling preachers who occasionally passed through their region, memorizing their mannerisms and adopting their speech patterns until he could quote scripture with the same fervor and authority as any ordained minister. His deep voice would boom across the mountain hollow as he recited verses about hospitality to strangers and the Christian duty to feed the hungry, while his eyes remained cold and calculating behind the mask of religious enthusiasm. Ruth complemented his performance perfectly, her soft-spoken demeanor and modest dress creating the image of the ideal frontier Christian wife. Though her gentle hands had learned to wield butcher knives with the same skill she used for preparing their twisted family meals. The cabin itself had been transformed into a theatrical set designed to reinforce their deception, with crosses positioned at eye level where visitors couldn't miss them and Bible verses painted in careful script across the walls where the lamplight would illuminate them during evening conversations. Ruth had sewn curtains from rough cloth and arranged the simple furniture to create an atmosphere of humble prosperity that suggested a family blessed by divine providence, while Elijah had carved additional crosses from pine wood and placed them throughout the property, like boundary markers proclaiming their Christian territory. Their children had been trained from birth to play their roles in the family's deadly charade, with Thomas learning to mumble prayers despite his speech impediment, and Sarah practicing the shy smile that made her withered arms seem like a cross to bear rather than a sign of genetic corruption. Even Isaac, whose damaged mind made complex deception impossible, had been taught simple responses that reinforced the family's religious image when visitors asked about their faith or their isolation from the world below. The most crucial element of their deception was the timing of their religious performances, which Elijah had choreographed to coincide with moments when travelers were most vulnerable to suggestion and least likely to remain suspicious. Evening prayers conducted by candlelight created an atmosphere of sacred intimacy that made visitors feel honored to witness such private devotion, while morning blessings over breakfast reinforced the impression that the Hartwells lived every moment of their lives in conscious service to God. Ruth had become particularly skilled at using religious conversation to extract information from their guests, asking innocent questions about their destinations and their cargo, while discussing the challenges of maintaining Christian faith in the wilderness. Her gentle probing revealed not only the practical details the family needed for planning their attacks, but also the personal information that allowed them to gauge each victim's likely reactions under stress and their potential for fighting back or escaping. The family's religious facade had evolved into something far more sophisticated than simple camouflage, becoming a weapon that they wielded with the same precision as their knives and clubs. They had learned that travelers who trusted in their Christian hospitality would ignore warning signs that might have saved their lives, and that victims who died believing their hosts were fellow believers would go to their graves without ever understanding the true nature of the evil that had consumed them. The mountain pass wasn't chosen randomly. It was the perfect killing ground where screams echoed into empty wilderness and bodies disappeared without witnesses. Jeremiah Hartwell had selected the location with the strategic mind of a predator, recognizing that the natural geography would serve his family's dark purposes for generations to come. The cabin sat in a natural depression surrounded by steep ridges that rose like amphitheater walls on three sides, creating an acoustic trap that contained sound while providing multiple vantage points for watching approaching travelers. The single narrow path that led to their homestead wound through dense pine forest for nearly 2 miles, ensuring that visitors would be exhausted and disoriented by the time they reached the Hartwell door, while the treacherous footing made rapid escape virtually impossible for anyone unfamiliar with the hidden routes that only the family knew. Elijah had spent years perfecting the tactical advantages of their position, clearing sight lines that allowed the family to observe travelers long before they could see the cabin, while maintaining thick brush cover that concealed the more disturbing evidence of their activities. A small creek that ran behind the property provided both fresh water and a convenient method for washing away blood, while the rocky soil made digging graves unnecessary since bodies could be weighted with stones and sunk in the deep pools that formed where the creek curved around massive boulders. The family had developed a systematic approach to their killings that exploited every feature of their environment. Beginning with Ruth's practice of serving their victims a hearty evening meal laced with a tincture made from local plants that induced drowsiness without causing immediate suspicion. While their guests slipped into drug-induced sleep, the family would quietly secure their weapons and valuables, then move the unconscious victims to a crude wooden table in the cabin's back room, where Thomas and Isaac would hold them down while Elijah delivered the killing blow with a heavy hammer designed for slaughtering livestock. The butchering process took place in a shed that Elijah had constructed specifically for processing their human prey, equipped with meat hooks suspended from the rafters and a drainage system that channeled blood directly into the creek. Ruth had become expert at separating the usable meat from what the family considered waste, while Sarah learned to cure and preserve the flesh using the same smoking techniques that frontier families applied to venison and pork. The remaining bones and unusable portions were either burned in a fire pit dug deep into the rocky ground, or carried to a limestone cave system that honeycombed the ridge above their cabin. Perhaps most chilling was the family's method of disposing of their victims' personal effects, which they had learned to distribute carefully over time and distance to avoid creating patterns that might alert authorities. Clothing was burned or buried in scattered locations throughout the mountains, while valuables were cached in hidden spots that could be accessed months later when the danger of discovery had passed. Horses and wagons presented special challenges, but the family had discovered remote ravines where vehicles could be dismantled and animals could be slaughtered for food. Their remains scattered to look like natural deaths from predation or accident. The Hartwells had transformed their isolated homestead into a death factory that operated with terrifying efficiency, and their 3 years of practice had eliminated most of the risks that might have led to their exposure. They had learned to read the mountain weather patterns that would discourage search parties, to recognize the types of travelers whose disappearances would generate the least investigation, and to time their kills to coincide with seasonal migration patterns that would mask the absence of their victims until the trail had gone completely cold. In spring of 1873, merchant Samuel Brewster became the first documented victim, though the Hartwells had been perfecting their methods for years before anyone noticed the pattern. Brewster, a middle-aged trader carrying leather goods and tools from the eastern settlements to the growing communities near Charleston, had planned his route specifically to include an overnight stop at the Hartwell cabin after hearing glowing recommendations from other travelers who had enjoyed their Christian hospitality. What made Brewster's disappearance significant wasn't just that he vanished without a trace, but that his brother William had been expecting him for a business meeting that Samuel never missed, and William's subsequent inquiries revealed that several other merchants had also failed to complete their planned journeys through that same mountain pass. The pattern might have been dismissed as accidents or bandit attacks, except that none of the missing travelers' goods had surfaced in any of the regional markets where stolen merchandise typically appeared. The second confirmed victim was Martha Keening, a widow traveling west with her 2 young children to join relatives in Ohio after her husband's death left her destitute in Virginia. Martha had specifically sought out the Hartwell cabin after hearing from other women about Ruth's kindness to families in need, and her disappearance created a different kind of investigation since her relatives in Ohio had been expecting her arrival and immediately contacted authorities when she failed to appear. The fact that an entire family had vanished without leaving any trace of their wagon, their belongings, or their bodies suggested something far more sinister than ordinary frontier hazards. By the fall of 1873, 3 more travelers had disappeared along the same route, including circuit preacher Reverend Joshua Mills, whose absence from scheduled sermons in 4 different communities created a network of concerned congregations demanding answers from local sheriffs. Mills had been traveling with church funds collected for a new schoolhouse, and the missing money added a financial dimension to the investigation that brought pressure from community leaders who couldn't afford to ignore the growing crisis. The Hartwells had initially chosen their victims carefully, targeting isolated individuals whose disappearances would generate minimal investigation. But their growing confidence and their increasing appetite for both material goods and human flesh had led them to take greater risks. They began targeting families with children, merchant convoys carrying valuable cargo, and even local officials whose absences would inevitably trigger formal investigations that frontier law enforcement couldn't ignore indefinitely. Sheriff William Hayes of the county seat had received 7 separate missing person reports by early 1874, all involving travelers whose last known location placed them along the mountain pass, where the Hartwell cabin offered the only shelter for 20 miles in any direction. Hayes had initially dismissed the reports as unfortunate, but expected casualties of frontier travel, where bad weather, dangerous animals, and treacherous terrain claimed lives regularly. But the complete absence of any physical evidence began to strike him as suspicious. The breakthrough came when Hayes interviewed surviving family members and business partners of the missing travelers, discovering that several victims had specifically mentioned their intention to stop at the Hartwell cabin and had even described the family's reputation for Christian charity and excellent meals. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, and Hayes realized that he was dealing with either an extraordinary series of accidents occurring at the same location or something far more deliberate and deadly. What Hayes didn't yet understand was that the 17 documented disappearances represented only the cases where someone had cared enough to report the missing travelers, and that the true number of victims was likely much higher when accounting for drifters, outcasts, and desperate souls whose absence from the world would never be noticed or reported to authorities. What horrified investigators most wasn't just the killing. It was discovering that the Hartwells had been consuming their victims in twisted family dinners blessed with prayer. The ritualistic nature of their cannibalism revealed a level of moral corruption that went far beyond simple murder for profit, transforming their crimes into something that challenged the very understanding of human nature. Ruth Hartwell had developed an elaborate system for preparing human flesh that she treated with the same care and attention that other frontier wives devoted to preserving venison or pork. She had learned to identify the choicest cuts from their victims, developing preferences for younger travelers whose meat she claimed was more tender, while discovering preservation techniques that allowed the family to maintain their supply of human protein throughout the harsh mountain winters when fresh victims were scarce. The family dining room had become the center of their most disturbing rituals, where Elijah would lead lengthy prayers of thanksgiving before each meal, praising God for providing sustenance for his faithful servants, while the platters contained flesh carved from travelers who had trusted in their Christian hospitality. Ruth would serve these meals with the same maternal pride she might have shown for any family dinner, discussing the flavor and preparation while their children consumed human meat as naturally as if it were beef or mutton. Most chilling was the family's ability to rationalize their cannibalism through twisted religious logic that portrayed their victims as divine provisions sent by God to sustain his chosen servants in their mountain isolation. Elijah had developed an entire theological framework that justified their consumption of human flesh by comparing their situation to biblical accounts of God providing meat for the Israelites in the wilderness. While Ruth spoke of their meals as communion experiences that brought the family closer to divine understanding through shared sacrifice. The children had been raised to view cannibalism as a normal part of their family's religious practice, with Thomas and Sarah learning to participate in the butchering process as naturally as other children might help with farm chores. Even Isaac, despite his mental limitations, had been taught to say special prayers over their human meals, his damaged mind accepting the family's explanations about God's special provisions for his faithful servants without question or moral conflict. Evidence discovered later revealed that the family had developed distinct preferences among their victims, with Ruth keeping detailed notes about which travelers provided the best meat and which preparation methods produced the most satisfying meals. They had learned to identify physical characteristics in their victims that predicted flavor and texture, while developing seasonal menus that took advantage of their victims' varying nutritional states depending on the time of year and the hardships of frontier travel. The psychological dimension of their cannibalism was perhaps even more disturbing than the physical acts themselves, as the family had created elaborate justifications that allowed them to maintain their self-image as devout Christians while regularly consuming human flesh. They genuinely believed that their religious devotion elevated their cannibalism above mere savagery, viewing themselves as instruments of divine will rather than common murderers driven by hunger or madness. What made their crimes truly incomprehensible was the evidence that the family had actually grown to prefer human flesh over conventional meat, rejecting opportunities to hunt wild game in favor of waiting for their next human victim to arrive at their door. They had become so dependent on cannibalism that it represented not just a method of disposal for their murder victims, but the primary motivation for continuing their killing spree when they could have simply robbed travelers and allowed them to leave alive. The Hartwell's downfall began when 15-year-old Mary Hartwell, born of brother and sister, finally understood that her family's blessed meals weren't gifts from God. Despite the genetic damage that had twisted her features and limited her mental development, Mary possessed enough awareness to recognize that the meat her grandmother Ruth served with such pride came from the same travelers who had shared evening prayers with the family just hours before their deaths. The revelation came during a particularly brutal killing in late summer of 1875, when a young couple traveling to their wedding in Charleston had sought shelter at the Hartwell cabin after their horse went lame on the treacherous mountain path. Mary had watched from the shadows as her father Elijah and Uncle Thomas dragged the unconscious bride from the main room to the butchering shed, while Ruth calmly began sharpening her knives for the preparation that would follow. Something in the bride's face, perhaps a resemblance to Mary's own tortured features, triggered a moment of clarity that cut through years of conditioning and twisted religious instruction. Mary's growing horror at her family's actions created the first crack in their unified front, as her questions about the source of their meat and her reluctance to participate in their ritual meals began to generate suspicion among the other family members. Ruth attempted to reassure her granddaughter with increased doses of the religious indoctrination that had justified their cannibalism, but Mary's damaged mind had somehow retained enough moral instinct to recognize evil when she finally saw it clearly. The family's paranoia intensified when Mary began refusing to eat the human flesh that formed the centerpiece of their evening meals, claiming that God was speaking to her in dreams and telling her that their food was cursed. Elijah initially dismissed her concerns as the ravings of an inbred mind, but when Mary started attempting to warn arriving travelers by making strange gestures and uttering cryptic phrases about death and danger, the family realized that their most vulnerable member had become their greatest threat. Thomas and Isaac were assigned to watch Mary constantly, preventing her from leaving the cabin grounds or communicating with visitors, but her obvious distress and her increasingly frantic attempts to signal danger began to make travelers uncomfortable in ways that threatened the family's carefully maintained facade of Christian hospitality. Ruth tried to explain Mary's behavior as religious fervor or feminine hysteria, but observant visitors noticed that the girl's agitation seemed specifically connected to mealtime preparations and the family's discussions of their food supplies. The family's response to Mary's rebellion revealed the depths of their corruption, as they began discussing among themselves whether their own blood relative might need to be eliminated to protect their hunting operation. Elijah argued that Mary's genetic damage made her unreliable and dangerous, while Ruth struggled between her maternal instincts and her commitment to preserving the cannibalistic lifestyle that had sustained the family for 3 years. Mary's desperate attempts to escape her family's control grew more bold as autumn approached, and she began leaving subtle signs around the cabin that she hoped might warn future travelers of the danger they faced. She would arrange crosses in patterns that suggested death or mourning, hide travelers' personal items where they might be discovered by later visitors, and even attempt to write warning messages using charcoal from the fireplace, though her limited literacy made these efforts largely unsuccessful. The breaking point came when Mary finally managed to speak directly to a traveling merchant, whispering warnings about death and cannibalism that the terrified man initially dismissed as the ravings of an inbred mountain girl. However, something in Mary's desperation convinced him to cut his visit short and leave immediately, taking with him the first eyewitness account of the Hartwell family's suspicious behavior that would eventually reach the ears of Sheriff William Hayes and trigger the investigation that would expose their crimes to the world. When Sheriff William Hayes finally reached the Hartwell cabin in October 1875, The smell of decay led him to discoveries that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The merchant who had escaped Mary's desperate warnings had provided enough disturbing details to convince Hayes that a formal investigation was warranted, though nothing could have prepared him for the horror he would uncover in that remote mountain hollow. Hayes arrived with 2 deputies and a local tracker. Approaching the cabin with weapons drawn after their horses became increasingly agitated as they neared the Hartwell property. The family's dogs, which normally announced visitors with enthusiastic barking, remained silent and cowered in the shadows, their behavior suggesting that even the animals understood they were living in a place touched by evil. The religious decorations that had once provided such convincing camouflage now seemed ominous in the gray October light, their wooden crosses casting shadows that resembled grave markers across the cabin's weathered walls. Elijah emerged to greet the lawmen with his usual performance of Christian hospitality, but Hayes noticed immediately that the man's eyes held a desperate quality that hadn't been present in earlier encounters. While Ruth remained inside the cabin rather than joining her husband on the porch, as she had always done when previous visitors arrived. The family's children were nowhere to be seen, though Hayes could hear movement and whispered conversations coming from the cabin's back rooms that suggested the occupants were preparing for something other than a friendly social visit. The breakthrough came when Hayes demanded to search the property and Elijah's religious facade finally cracked under the pressure, revealing the calculating predator that had been hidden beneath years of careful deception. Rather than submitting to lawful authority, as any innocent Christian would have done, Elijah began making threats and demands that exposed his true nature. While Ruth's voice could be heard from inside the cabin, giving urgent instructions to her children in preparation for violence. Hayes and his men forced their way into the cabin when the family refused to cooperate, discovering immediately that the religious symbols adorning the walls were stained with what appeared to be dried blood, while the wooden floors showed evidence of repeated scrubbing that had failed to eliminate dark stains concentrated around the back room, where the family conducted their butchering operations. The smell that had greeted them outside became overwhelming once they entered the confined space, a combination of decay, blood, and human waste that spoke of systematic killing conducted over an extended period. The most damning evidence was discovered in the family's food storage areas, where Hayes found preserved meat that his experienced eye immediately recognized as human flesh, along with Ruth's detailed notes describing preparation methods and flavor preferences that left no doubt about the source of the family's protein. Personal effects belonging to missing travelers were hidden throughout the cabin, including jewelry, clothing, and official documents that provided positive identification of at least 12 victims whose disappearances had been reported to various law enforcement agencies. The butchering shed behind the cabin contained the most horrific evidence of all, with meat hooks still bearing traces of human tissue and a drainage system that had channeled blood directly into the creek that supplied the family's drinking water. Hayes discovered bone fragments scattered around a fire pit, along with partially buried clothing and personal items that painted a clear picture of systematic murder and disposal that had been conducted with chilling efficiency. When Hayes attempted to arrest the family members, Thomas and Isaac attacked with the same ferocity they had shown their victims, while Mary cowered in a corner screaming warnings about the cursed meat and the devil's communion that had poisoned her family's souls, her damaged mind finally free to speak the truth that had been building inside her for months. The trial of the surviving Hartwells became a spectacle that drew crowds from across 3 counties. But justice for 17 victims would prove complicated by questions of sanity and generations of inbreeding. The courthouse in Charleston had never hosted proceedings that challenged the fundamental assumptions about human nature and moral responsibility, while the evidence presented during testimony forced jurors to confront horrors that most civilized people could scarcely imagine. Defense attorney Marcus Kellerman faced the impossible task of representing clients whose crimes exceeded the bounds of legal precedent and human understanding, ultimately arguing that 3 generations of inbreeding had created individuals whose mental capacity was so compromised that they could not be held responsible for their actions under traditional legal standards. Kellerman presented medical testimony about the effects of genetic isolation on cognitive development and moral reasoning, while documenting the physical deformities that provided visible evidence of the family's genetic deterioration. Prosecutor James Wellington countered with testimony from Sheriff Hayes and his deputies, who described in graphic detail the systematic nature of the Hartwell crimes and the evidence that showed careful planning and deliberate deception over multiple years. Wellington argued that the family's ability to maintain their religious facade and successfully lure victims to their deaths demonstrated sufficient mental capacity to understand right from wrong, regardless of their genetic damage or physical deformities. The courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly tense as witnesses testified about the cannibalistic aspects of the crimes, with several jurors requiring medical attention after hearing Ruth Hartwell's detailed descriptions of her preparation methods and the family's mealtime rituals. The prosecutor's decision to present physical evidence, including preserved human flesh and victims' personal effects, created such revulsion among spectators that the judge was forced to clear the gallery multiple times to maintain order. Mary Hartwell's testimony provided the most compelling evidence of the family's guilt, as her broken attempts to describe their crimes carried the authenticity of lived horror that no lawyer could fabricate or dismiss. Despite her genetic damage and limited vocabulary, Mary's account of her family's hunting methods and cannibalistic practices painted a picture of calculated evil that undermined defense arguments about diminished mental capacity, while her desperate attempts to warn victims demonstrated that at least some moral awareness had survived within the corrupted bloodline. The community's demand for justice created additional pressure on the legal proceedings, as families of missing travelers filled the courthouse demanding answers about their lost loved ones, while local citizens struggled to comprehend how such evil could have flourished undetected in their midst for 3 years. The realization that respected community members had recommended the Hartwell cabin to unsuspecting travelers created feelings of collective guilt and responsibility that intensified calls for the harshest possible punishment. Elijah and Ruth Hartwell showed no remorse during the trial, maintaining their twisted religious justifications even while facing execution, with Elijah claiming that God had chosen his family to serve as instruments of divine judgment against sinful travelers who deserved their fate. Ruth's testimony about her cooking methods and preservation techniques was delivered with the same maternal pride she had shown when serving human flesh to her family, demonstrating a complete absence of normal moral development that horrified everyone present. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts for murder in the first degree, though the judge's sentencing reflected the complex legal questions raised by the defense arguments about genetic damage and mental capacity. Elijah and Ruth were sentenced to death by hanging, while Thomas received life imprisonment due to his severe speech impediment and apparent intellectual limitations, and Isaac was committed to a state asylum where his damaged mind could be studied by physicians attempting to understand the relationship between inbreeding and criminal behavior. The Hartwell cabin was burned to ash in November 1875, but the mountain pass still claims travelers who don't heed the warnings of what isolation and desperation can create. Sheriff Hayes personally supervised the destruction of every structure on the Hartwell property, ensuring that no physical reminder would remain to attract morbid curiosity seekers or inspire copycat crimes, though he knew that the psychological scars left by the family's evil would endure far longer than any building. Mary Hartwell, the sole family member whose testimony had helped convict her relatives, was placed in the care of a charitable organization that specialized in helping damaged individuals rebuild their lives. Despite her genetic handicaps and the trauma of her upbringing, Mary showed remarkable progress once removed from her family's toxic influence, eventually learning to read simple texts and developing enough social skills to work in a supervised environment where her tragic past remained unknown to her caretakers and fellow workers. The executions of Elijah and Ruth Hartwell drew thousands of spectators to Charleston, where their final statements revealed no trace of remorse or understanding of their crimes, with both maintaining their twisted religious justifications until the moment the hangman's nooses ended their lives. Thomas died in prison within 2 years, his weakened constitution unable to survive the harsh conditions of frontier incarceration, while Isaac spent the remainder of his life in the state asylum, where physicians documented his case as one of the most extreme examples of genetic deterioration resulting from prolonged inbreeding. The legal precedents established by the Hartwell trial influenced future cases involving questions of mental capacity and genetic damage, while the medical testimony about inbreeding effects contributed to early understanding of genetic science that would eventually lead to laws prohibiting marriage between close relatives. The case became required study material in both legal and medical schools, serving as a cautionary tale about the intersection of isolation, genetic damage, and moral corruption. Investigation into the full extent of the Hartwell crimes continued for months after the trial, as authorities worked to identify additional victims whose disappearances had never been officially reported. The final count of confirmed victims reached 23 individuals, including entire families whose absence from the world had been noted only by the Hartwells themselves, while estimates of possible additional victims ranged as high as 40 people over the 6 years that the family had operated their killing ground. A monument was erected in Charleston's main cemetery honoring the known victims of the Hartwell murders, bearing the names of those who had been identified through personal effects and testimony, while including a dedication to the unknown souls whose remains were scattered throughout the mountain wilderness. The inscription reminded visitors that these victims had died far from home, while seeking nothing more than shelter and Christian hospitality from people they trusted. The mountain pass where the Hartwell cabin once stood remained largely abandoned for decades after their crimes were exposed, with local guides refusing to lead travelers through the area and regional maps eventually showing alternate routes that avoided the cursed hollow entirely. Even today, hikers and hunters report feeling an inexplicable sense of dread when passing through the region, while local folklore maintains that the spirits of the Hartwell victims still wander the mountains seeking justice for their unavenged murders. The legacy of the Hartwell case extends beyond its immediate horror to serve as a stark reminder of how quickly civilization can collapse when isolation, desperation, and moral corruption combine with genetic damage to create something that challenges our understanding of human nature itself. Their story stands as testament to the 17 innocent souls who trusted in Christian charity and paid for that trust with their lives, ensuring that their memory survives long after the mountain wilderness has reclaimed the site of their suffering. That's it for today's story. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel to support our continued stories inspired by forgotten crimes. Let me know in the comments below what other cases you'd like us to explore. And remember to treat this story as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most innocent facades.